From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. I'm Ty Morgan, and here's what's in store over the next 60 minutes. The Trump administration hits China with more tariffs. Now, China says it's not afraid of a trade war, while pork is caught in the middle. Another interest rate hike could weigh heavily on farmers.
Not only is it an interest rate hike, but the total cost for your farming operation is much larger than it would have been even 3 or 4 years ago.
With more hikes in store, now one lender has growing concerns that loan delinquencies could be on the rise. As dairy prices struggle, now more than 80 farmers are left without a home for their milk.
Unfortunate as this situation is, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll come up with a path forward.
We walk in the shoes of a dairyman fighting for his family's farming future, just like so many others today. And in John's world,
boneless chicken wings. Yeah, right.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Chevy Silverado, the most dependable, longest-lasting full-size pickups on the road.
Now for the news, the president rolling out a proposal to slap tariffs on as much as $60 billion worth of Chinese imports. But the Chinese already firing back, saying they aren't afraid of a trade war, and it's goods like U.S. pork caught in the line of fire.
It's going to make us a much stronger, much richer nation.
Signing an order Thursday, the president says the tariffs are in response to concerns that China steals U.S. intellectual property. The administration believes China forces American companies to transfer technological insight to Chinese firms in hopes of doing business in the Asian country. Now, the administration is saying this is the first of many actions against China, but a formal World Trade Organization complaint will be filed. But China already hit back, including saying it will put a 25% tariff on imported pork from the U.S. And the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs says it doesn't want a trade war, but isn't afraid of having one, and that the U.S. underestimates the price the U.S. may have to pay for what it calls reckless behavior. Now, national pork producers responding, pointing out China is the industry's #2 buyer, with a $1.1 billion worth of pork exported there last year. NPPC president said, quote, "No one wins in these tit-for-tat trade disputes, least of all the farmers and the consumers," end quote. Well, as the administration debates whether to place a short-term cap on RIN values, the issue may end up in the hands of Congress. New reports this week indicate the White House is considering punting the RFS decision to Congress, saying legislators are better suited to settle the long-running dispute between the ethanol and oil industries. But the rub is over the price of biofuel credits, or RINs. Clinton Griffiths recently sat down exclusively with the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt about what legally the agency can do.
But I think what is really our focus at this point is providing clarity on the RVP waiver, on whether that's something we can do legally. We've been involved in about a 4 to 6 month process at least, evaluating that question. It is a legal question and not a policy question. And what I mean by that is, it isn't a matter of preference or discretion. It's a matter of whether the statute authorizes and permits that kind of decision. There are arguments on both sides. And so we're trying to evaluate the merits and demerits of those arguments, the language in the statute, to determine what authority does exist at the agency on granting the ability to sell 12 months a year. So practically, you look at that and you think, absolutely it makes sense to be able to sell 12 months a year. It helps for the infrastructure. Sure. It helps for, but at the same time, is it authorized by the statute? So that's something we're trying to get fixed and work and really get an answer to in the near term.
All right, thanks, Clinton. Well, interest rates continue to climb higher. The Federal Reserve raising the benchmark lending rate by a quarter point this week. However, with the economy improving, there are signals that steeper hikes could be in store for both 2019 and 2020. New research by Farmer Mac reveals that rising interest rates can lead to increased risk for the farming sector, as rising rates puts downward pressure on farmland values. Farmer Mac warns that loan delinquency rates, which have remained low, could increase if interest rates continue to rise. That's as higher interest rates will mean farmers will have to pay more for new or variable rate credit over the next several years. Kurt Covington of Farmer Mac says that comes at a time when working capital on farms is already shrinking.
Banks are having to fund a much larger proportion of their operating needs of these farmers. So when we say, okay, interest rates go up 25 basis points or 50 basis points, that takes it in one context, but the other context is, when your liquidity is that low, you're having to borrow more money from the bank. So in absolute dollars, not only is it an interest rate hike, but the total cost for your farming operation is much larger than it would have been even 3 or 4 years ago. So I encourage farmers to think of it in terms of absolute dollars because they're having to borrow more money, and lenders are looking at it from the same perspective.
Farmer Mac says despite rising rates, this isn't a repeat of the 1980s. That's as many farmers appear to be better positioned to service their debt. But they point out wheat and livestock operations may have the most difficult time repaying loans. On Wednesday, European Commission giving conditional approval for Bayer to buy Monsanto. Bayer's CEO calling it a significant milestone. Bayer already agreed to sell off its U.S. business and part of its digital farming portfolio to BASF. But now Monsanto also agreeing to divest its NemaStrike technology to BASF. Now, despite recent issues in receiving U.S. regulatory approval, both Bayer and Monsanto say they remain confident the deal will still close the second quarter of this year. All right, that's it for the news. We need to take a quick break, but we'll check in with meteorologist Mike Hoffman to see if the drought in the plains grew any this past week. Please stay with us.
Agriculture's national forecast is brought to you by Elevo seed treatment from Bayer.
Well, it's time now to check weather with meteorologist Mike Hoffman. Mike, now some of the parched areas of the country did receive a little rain this week, but now that we're in the spring, it just seems like those dry areas just keep getting drier.
Thanks, Tyne. There is no doubt as we head into this growing season that we are concerned about areas around the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma Panhandle, and southwestern Kansas. While a lot of the southeast and southern Mississippi Valley have improved on the drought monitor over the past couple of months, not so much there, and it's gotten worse back into the Four Corner region as well. So let's go back a month. You can see a lot more color farther to the east. We were already seeing the improvement, though, in many parts of the southeast, but over the last 4 weeks, we've seen that improve even more as this just goes away, even the moderate drought in many parts of the southeast. Now, still southeast Georgia, a little bit on the dry side, but our main concern is going to be western Oklahoma, northwest Texas, and southwestern Kansas, back into the Four Corner region. Even California, these last 2 or 3 weeks have seen so much rain and mountain snows that you folks have been improving as well. Here's the overall pattern. We've seen the trough in the west, trough in the east for most of the last month or so, with a ridge occasionally in the central part of the country, but really the warm air has mainly stayed in the south central plains into the southwest. As we head through time, we're seeing a little bit of a change here through the middle of this week. It's actually showing a cutoff in the southwest. That hasn't happened very much in this pattern. We see a ridge in the southeast warming things up for a change. And then as we head into the latter parts of the week and into the weekend, you can kind of see how we're going a little bit more zonal here. Now, do we go back to a trough in the west and a trough in the east again? I'm not sure, but there's at least signs that we might see a transition phase here later this week and into this coming weekend. Something we'll be watching for you. Let's go day by day then. On Monday, double barrel system in the plain states with a fair amount of rain in places, some thunderstorms farther south, a little bit of snow in the northwest corner of this area. By Wednesday then, the main systems are moving off through Canada. Another one forms on the southern end of this front with a fair amount of rain once again in the southern plains, southern Mississippi Valley. Just a touch of snow with that next system coming through the northern portions of the Rockies, and this system kind of stalls out with a stationary front along the Canadian border by Friday. Cold front along the east coast and another developing low pressure system in far south Texas with a little bit of rain, but most of the lower 48 by the end of this week looking dry. Here's my 30-day outlook for temperatures. I'm going below normal from the Ohio River Valley through the Great Lakes, through the northeast, most of the northern plains from the Four Corner region through the Gulf Coast areas. Above normal temperatures expected over the next 30 days. As far as precipitation goes, the far southeast below normal, southwest below normal, above normal for the western Dakotas northwestward, and also from the Great Lakes all the way down through the southern Mississippi Valley. Tyne?
Major tariff news out of Washington and China this week. We'll break it down in the Marketing Roundtable with Matt Bennett and Brian Doherty after the break. U.S.
Farm Report is brought to you by Liberty Herbicide, the simply better solution for superior weed control and stronger yield.
Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report. Matt Bennett, Brian Doherty joining me this week. Thank you so much. No shortage of things to talk about. Let's jump right into it. This possible trade war with Trump coming out with proposing new tariffs on Chinese goods. Steel and aluminum tariff went into effect this week. At the same time, China's saying we're not afraid of a trade war, hitting pork first. How detrimental would a trade war be for all of our commodities, Matt?
Well, I don't think anybody really wins whenever we're talking trade wars. Bottom line, most people say that it drives costs up. It's going to be pretty tough for producers all around the board. I guess one thing that we know, and we've known for quite some time, is they're going to retaliate. As Trump has talked about having tariffs. Whenever I looked at the soybean situation, or look at the soybean situation, I think they're going to come out and say, we're going to do something whenever it comes to soybeans. Why are they going to say that? Ultimately, I think it's probably going to be able to source cheaper soybeans, because they have to buy beans off of us.
So initially, if we do, we've already seen it hit pork. We saw what happened with hog prices this week. We saw it take a deep dive. If we hear China say, even threat that that they are going to place a tariff on soybeans, do we see prices tank?
Probably initially, but China cannot not buy beans from the United States, and so it might be just rhetoric. Let's call it a ploy potentially to drive prices down, to sneak back in and buy at a cheaper level. They are in a very tenuous situation here. They need our products. And I don't think they want to get into this kind of a tariff war, but they're firing back, and they did so very minimally. But you've got two kind of bulls out there facing off, and this is where it starts. But I would encourage producers to be careful and be defensive soybeans in case it does happen. Yeah,
but is China buying beans today?
China's been buying beans every day. China's not in the market, so they may hold back a little bit, but the bean market barely flinched today. It started out weaker, and it didn't roar back, but it clawed back today.
Yeah, unlike the stock market this week. Matt, at the same time next week, we have a big report coming out of USDA, the Planting Intentions Report. We assume that we're going to see an increase in soybean acres overall. Do you think that we will see over 91 million acres of soybeans?
That's a wonderful question. If you believe a lot of the survey-based experts, if you will, the surveys they put out, yeah, I think that there is reason to believe that you could go over 91. Me personally, I've always been in this situation where I've probably been 500,000 to 1 million more acres of beans than corn. Some of the areas that I've been to this year have surprised me and said that they were going to stick with corn. Of course, these are heavy livestock areas where maybe basis is just a little bit better. But bottom line for me, I think that if you do get over 91, I surely want to be defensive, as Brian was saying. I got to be careful, because you could have a double whammy effect this week, whenever we're talking about China and then large acreage. So I think that there's two different things to talk about, corn and bean acres. But as far as bean acres go, yeah, I think over 91 is a very, very good possibility.
Well, but it's not like we haven't been talking about these bigger soybean numbers. So the trade is obviously aware that possibly could happen. But what would the knee-jerk reaction be on the soybean market if we are north of 91 million?
Probably a little negative, because the managed money, fund money, went aggressively long the bean market, atmospherically long here in the last month, mostly on issues in Argentina. So the market blows up, and there's plenty of room for it to correct back. But when you step back and look at the big fundamental picture, the world is using supply. So pullbacks over the last 24 months, not only in corn, soybeans, wheat, but commodities, have proven to be nothing more than buy opportunities.
Let's talk about those outside markets. How heavily invested in the corn and the soybean market are they today? And let's say they decide to change their position. How big of a swing could we get on price?
Well, you buy 440,000 contracts of corn. December corn ended up moving about 35 cents. On Monday, we dropped 7 cents, and I think that we sold around 20,000 contracts. The funds did. And so, obviously you lose 20% of the rally right there on only 20,000. And the bottom line is you've had this huge hedge pressure on the way up. There's been willing sellers all the way up. Is there going to be willing buyers all the way down? Obviously, it's not to the tune that we've seen it on the way up.
Brian, real quick, corn.
Yeah.
I mean, like we've been talking about some bullish rhetoric here, looking at Planting Intentions Report. What are your expectations for corn?
How much time do we have? Let's keep the big picture in perspective. The world is using more corn than it's producing, and the U.S. is likely to lose some corn acres, so downside potential limited for now. All
right, we'll talk much more about corn in markets now. Go on agweb.com to check that out. But we need to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more U.S. Farm Report.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Prosaro Fungicide from Bayer.
Well, in the midst of March Madness, sports fanatics are hosting parties across the country. And on their menu, maybe a trendy food, chicken wings. And it's that popularity growth that's the topic of this week's John's World. John?
Not being much of a sports fan anymore and no longer allowed to do grocery shopping unsupervised, I have missed out on a rather remarkable development in meat prices. While I knew that chicken consumption has risen steadily for decades, even as it blew other protein out of the water with its extremely low cost for consumers, I had no idea what was happening to the individual markets for different chicken parts. When I did last pay attention, the most desirable chunk of the chicken was the breast meat. So at family dinners, you made sure you called out early for your share. The wings were, frankly, for losers. For a long time, as you can see by this chart of the ratio of chicken wing prices to breast meat, wings were a bargain at about 30% the price of breast meat. Then, around the turn of the century, things changed. Export demand for low-priced chicken, for one thing, along with a lot of new restaurant franchises with wings in the name. And this triggered a surge in wing prices. Looking at the last few years, whole wings have been selling routinely above breast meat and even tenderloins. By the way, if you don't get the title, it's from an old Wendy's commercial. I was not the only one surprised by the demand for wings. Chicken breeders who had been working with chickens to maximize the white meat suddenly faced a curious problem. No matter how big you grow a chicken, it only has 2 wings, although you gotta give those Chinese credit for claiming otherwise in this hoax that concerned KFC a few years back. One industry answer has been the boneless chicken wing. Only it is such a bald-faced lie that I find it hilarious. As you can read from this quote by an industry analyst, one way to combat soaring wing prices is to magically convert now relatively low-cost breast meat into something you can call a wing. The only reason there hasn't been any outrage about this, I think, is unlike the almond milk controversy, this is all within the same industry. There aren't wing producers and breast producers. And frankly, consumers don't seem to give a hoot. Although, boneless wings haven't caught fire, so to speak. Now, there is no deep moral to this story other than anybody who thinks they can predict food fads are kidding themselves. The secret to marketing to consumers today may be the ability to interpret market signals quicker and respond just a little bit faster than your competitors.
Very true. Thanks, John. All right, up next, we're heading down east for this week's Tractor Tales.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Resicor Corn Herbicide, a uniquely powerful formulation, extraordinary power over weeds.
Welcome back to Tractor Tales, folks. This week, we're going to visit with a tractor enthusiast in Virginia who has a Gibson E. Stanley Hula Jr. found this one in Ohio and shows it off in his museum. There were 2 versions of this Gibson made, one with a wide front and one with a tricycle. Stanley says this tractor is fun to drive.
We're standing next to a Gibson E that was purchased, I think it was in Avon, Ohio, probably about 12 years ago. I went out there to buy a Gibson SC. The gentleman had this tractor, and after some conversation, money exchanged hands, and I came home with 2. Now, he had another one that I would have preferred, and I want to say it was an I, but he would not part with that one. The SC was the D, and then they had the SC or SD. They were small tractors, and this one was the next one up in their lineup of horsepower. This is as I bought it. The gentleman that had it restored it, and it looked fine for the museum here, so I've left it just like it is. Haven't done anything to it. Haven't even put a new battery in it. It's going to stay here until either the museum is sold or it's just going to stay here as long as it needs to be. Have no plans of selling the tractor. It runs fine. It's a Wisconsin engine in it. It runs like a Wisconsin engine. It makes the old hay baler noise, and it runs fine. Once it gets started up, it runs fine. I ran around here quite a bit up until a few years ago when I stopped starting them. That would be the only thing that's not normal on is the lights. Otherwise, it's as it came from the as it was manufactured. And they made 2 models of this particular tractor, one with a wide front end and this one's a tricycle.
Thanks so much. Well, still to come, it's a dire situation for many dairies. With already struggling milk prices, some dairy farmers may be forced to exit the business if they don't find a new home for their milk. But it's many dairy producers who keep fighting to survive. And we have their story after the break.
U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report. Trusted, timely, tradition.
Well, new numbers out this week show milk production seems unstoppable. In February, total production grew nearly 2% year over year, and the number of milk cows on farms grew by 45,000. Now, it's that growth that's causing pain on dairy farms across the country, with some left without a home to ship their milk. But that's not stopping them from fighting for their future. And that's this week's Farm Journal Report. For Johnson County, Indiana farmer Joe Kelsey.
How's things going? Everything going well today?
Yeah.
It's not just another day.
Cows milking well?
He's continuing to pump milk while a cloud of uncertainty hangs over his farm.
Right now, it's a bit difficult to be a dairy farmer.
His job just became even more difficult. He found out in February from Dean Foods that he has 90 days to find a new home for his milk.
It was a little bit surprising, I guess, to kind of have this market and this market partner for so long and that relationship to look to be ending.
He not only received a letter in the mail, but he's also been in constant contact with the company he's done business with for more than 25 years.
Our conversations with both field staff and top leadership have been, they're very frustrated that this is the reality that they're dealing with.
Kelsey is one of 27 producers in Indiana and one of more than 80 across the country who received a letter from Dean Foods. In the letter, Dean calling it a difficult decision, but one based on 2 main factors. The first is the new Walmart milk processing plant coming online near Fort Wayne in May, and the second is the dairy market flooded with just too much milk.
We're caught at a time where there's just too much milk, more than what the market can bear at this moment.
I equate it to corn harvest with the elevator being full. There's just nowhere to put the milk.
Mike North of Commodity Risk Management Group says producers ramped up production as overall demand drew higher.
Demand grew, especially at the world level, and our producers made the investment, put their best foot forward, and they really rose to the occasion, and they brought a lot more milk to the table.
While demand climbs with appetites for items like cheese and butter growing, consumers continue to drink less milk, and that's adding to the oversupply pain. Dean Foods telling Farm Journal that milk consumption has dropped 11 gallons per person since 1975. At the same time, the U.S. dairy industry is producing 350 million more gallons of milk each year, a combination that's proving to be lethal to the industry in the form of suffering milk prices.
A lot of dairy producers' cost of production right now is exceeding what they're getting in their milk check.
North says as overall milk prices struggle, higher milk prices hinge on what happens this spring.
If we can eliminate enough supply this spring that we become short in that supply in our approach to fall, we do set the stage for that to happen.
But eliminating supply isn't an easy fix.
It takes 2 years to get an animal up to size to start milking, and then once you're rolling on that process, it's really hard to turn the spigot and adjust that spigot to the exact needs of the market.
That's why when the letter from Dean's came in the mail, he was overcome with concern.
The cows are making milk every day. We're 3 times a day milking, and we're a trailer load every other day out of our farm. And so where that has to go and how we can find a new market certainly rushes right in.
As concerns still weigh on his shoulders, he doesn't blame Dean's for the tough decision they made.
Dean Foods has been a great partner of ours for 25 years, and they have been nothing but professional about the approach.
It's those business decisions having an impact on farmers like Kelsey. But North says it's not healthy to condemn Dean's or Walmart.
This is not just a Walmart issue. This is not just a Dean's issue. This is an industry-wide experience right now where processors are overwhelmed by milk supply.
Instead of playing the blame game, Kelsey is committed on the hunt for a new buyer, and he started making calls immediately.
Initial responses are, milk supplies are pretty abundant at the moment.
While he's received some maybes,
we have received a handful of no's.
Kelsey says that's not stopping him from continuing the good fight. But the reality is some farmers may not find a new home.
In some situations, some dairy producers are going to have to sell not only the herd, but selling machinery, equipment, and maybe selling real estate as well, just to be able to cover their debts.
And as debts rise, Lang says it's a harsh reality that's setting in.
How many dollars they've lost or how much additional debt that they've had to take on, and are looking at those 2018 budgets and saying, boy, we're really going to be putting our business or our equity in a position that we don't feel comfortable with.
It's that dilemma Kelsey's facing today.
If we're negative margin, and we have been for a bit, how much more equity are we willing to invest to wait for these prices to improve? And that's going to be the question that I think our family and many other families are going to have those difficult conversations around kitchen tables as they come to the grips with that reality of that those price changes are real.
Whether a farmer is forced out of milk production or does so voluntarily, leaving the business isn't a mark of failure.
Failure to me is you see the writing on the wall, if you will, that this isn't working anymore, but you just hope things get better. While I try to be optimistic as much as anybody else, hope is a poor business plan.
While hope isn't Kelsey's plan, he remains determined a new market will surface.
As unfortunate as this situation is, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll come up with a path forward.
It's organizations like Indiana dairy producers who say they're doing everything they can to connect producers to potential buyers.
I'm talking to the co-ops, the buyers in the state, just trying to make the conversations happen.
It's LaPorte, Indiana producer Luke Minnick, who just went through a similar situation at the end of last year.
We were always very positive that we'd find a market for the milk.
He received a letter from Deans in the fall that they had 90 days to find a new home for their milk.
We received notice in October, and we were able to find a new milk buyer, joined a new co-op based in Ohio.
A search that took nearly the entire 90 days, but it's positivity that got their family through.
We've farmed for 6 generations now. I think it's probably the best way that I know how to raise a family.
And it's that same positivity carrying the Kelseys today.
Long term, I'm really bullish U.S. dairy. I think that our ability to grow feed and take care of animals and produce and then process milk and then distribute that milk and those dairy products is second to none in the entire world.
As an eternal optimist, he knows he also has to balance it with being a realist. And the reality is it's not only his family, but employees whose livelihoods pivot on the success of this dairy.
It's really a family. It's extended family. I mean, the folks that help us on the farm are absolutely critical to what we do every day.
And as one door closes, he's hopeful another door will open as he works to keep his family's legacy alive. While Kelsey is trying to stay positive, the reality is some farmers won't be able to stay in business. The dire situation in dairy caught the attention of the New York Times. Just this week, it posted a story about how suffering milk prices are forcing some New York dairies out of the business. And that's leading to more farmers to not only consider, but commit suicide. If you're considering taking your own life, we want to remind people that there is help. The Suicide Prevention Hotline is on the screen. It provides emotional support in emotional distress 24 hours a day. All right, we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk on our marketing roundtables about these struggling milk prices. Please stay with us.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Corvus Pre-Emergence Corn Herbicide from Bayer, the only herbicide to offer 3 levels of defense against weeds, burn down, residual, and activation with rain.
All right, welcome back. Brian Doherty, Matt Bennett join us again. Just had that Farm Journal report about the dire situation in dairy. You know, other than culling some of the cows and getting rid of some of the cows that we have out there producing less milk, what else could happen worldwide to drive milk prices higher at this point?
Yeah, what moves milk prices? Well, typically 2 things, less supply of milk or higher feed costs. Feed is pretty cheap right now. If we get weather this summer, 70% of the world's corn crop is produced in the northern hemisphere. So think what would happen if we talked about a drawdown in corn production. Unlike the last 5 years, corn prices begin to rally. You're going to see some very quick liquidation of cows. Also, beef prices higher than where they were in 2009 make that decision easier.
How likely is it that we will get significant higher corn prices this year?
Well, you know, whenever I look at world stocks, for instance, and, you know, some of the estimates right now are that Brazil, USDA could be 10 million metric ton too high on the Brazil corn crop. I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but if I were, as far as in Argentina maybe being 2 or 3 million metric ton too high still, we're going to end up drawing down world stocks year on year, 20% plus, and that is a huge amount. We're definitely using a lot of corn. If you would have told people a few months ago we're going to have a 176.6 on corn yield and we're still going to be closer to 2 billion than 2.5 billion bushel carry out, they would have said you're crazy. And so as far as corn goes, we have any weather problems this year and you do have 89 million acres or anything sub 90, in my opinion, you're looking at a pretty exciting market this summer.
Yep. Real quick, feed users, cattle. You know, cash market's telling us something different than the futures market right now. What is it telling us?
Well, as far as the cattle, I mean, you're seeing at least $10 higher at the sale barn than what you're seeing on the Merc. And so, bottom line, the demand up front is very good, but you still got this huge inverted market. It's a very scary proposition for the fat cattle producer.
What about pork prices? I mean, we've seen pork prices plummet after this news, this tariff news out of China. You know, it's just a proposal, kind of perception versus reality right now with that market because we don't know actually what China's going to do. But at the same time, we have struggling pork prices.
We do, and we've got a supply issue. Beef, let's go back to that as a competitor to pork. The second quarter should see record beef supplies. In pork, slaughter numbers over 440,000 consistently day in and day out. So you've got a supply issue there, and now this tariff issue, and then a cold storage report. So a lot of whammies on pork, but not a lot of downside potential because we're already relatively cheap. So demand will likely cycle back in. The dollar's been on the defensive. So defensive for sure, big supplies, but prices probably already get most, if not all of it, factored in.
All right, hopefully we'll get some more clarity on these tariffs around China, but from both sides of the aisle. But what do you want? What advice do you have for producers next week as we have a big report coming out?
Well, you know, if I haven't done a whole lot on new crop beans yet, I at least want to have some protection in place. I think that it makes good sense. Most producers that we work with, and I'm sure that Brian works with, can make pretty good money above $10 November beans. Might not be exactly what they want, but sure as heck it would beat some of the prices we've seen lately.
All right, Brian, your advice for this next week?
Yeah, same thing with Matt on beans. Beans have been offering an opportunity for quite some time. The handwriting's on the wall. Now, there is drawdown in Argentina, and that's still a wild card as to what that number will actually be. But you got this tariff issue, so I would go into next week with a defensive posture, probably put options in combination with some forward contracting on beans and in corn. I'd probably leave that market alone right now.
But we could have some fireworks next week.
Absolutely.
Always can. It's just an estimate, so things will change quickly after that. But right now, I don't think corn is in favor of buying acres from beans, so I would be more defensive beans. Bigger world stocks usage number of beans than relative to corn, too.
All right. Thank you both for being here. We appreciate it. Remember, check out agweb.com for Markets Now, a much larger discussion on corn prices right now, and a much more positive discussion on corn prices. All right, stay with us. We have much more on U.S. Farm Report when we come back. Baxter Black's previous commentary on leaving the ranch set off a range of emotions from viewers, with some worried that meant he would no longer be a part of this program. Well, I'm happy to report he's not only a part of this program, but we hope he continues to be a mainstay on our show. So with that, let's head out west to check in with Baxter Black this week.
Mules are peculiar. First, they're not real. They're the equivalent of a Caterpillar body on a Volkswagen chassis with Cadillac suspension, a Cummins diesel, and lawnmower wheels. Not to mention 2-dish antenna and a rear windshield wiper. Yes, mules seem to have an intelligence that horses do not. This is demonstrated by their traits of not overeating and not panicking in a tangle. And they do poop in designated areas. Yes, they do. But mules, unlike horses, also play by the rules. Often their own rules, but they always color within the lines. During Hurricane Floyd, North Carolina was hit hard. Dale and Jim had their property inundated. They led their 4 mules out to the road in knee-deep water towards safety. Well, the mules balked at the property line. Dale's house rules had forbidden the mules to cross that imaginary obstacle. So they freed the mules, thinking that when the water got high enough, they'd find a way to get out. But next morning, the mules were back in the barn and the water was up to their backs. So Jim haltered the boss mule and tied him to the 16-foot boat with an outboard motor. They putted out towards the road. Well, the mule came right along until he reached the edge of the property, where he dug in with all 4 feet and stopped the parade. Jim was in that boat, twisting the throttle and fishtailing in this boat and going nowhere, but then surely but steadily, the boss mule backed clear to the barn, towing the sputtering ship like he was reeling in a 400-pound catfish. But mules do like to have fun. Jackson Hole Jerry had a big mule. He liked to stand in the back of his little 2-horse trailer. Jerry came home one day to find the trailer at the bottom of the slope below the house. "Who moved the trailer?" he hollered. His wife said, "Not me." So Jerry hooked it up, pulled the trailer back to the top, and then he unhooked and started for the house, and he looked back to find his big mule clomping up into the trailer, and the tongue lifted off the ground, and down the hill he went. Jerry thought he heard him laughing. This is Baxter Black from out there.
Thanks, Baxter. You can hear more from Baxter by visiting baxterblack.com. All right, when we come back, John Phipps talks trade.
Trade agreements are not like rent contracts.
Your next piece of equipment is on machinerypete.com. Search equipment from dealerships across the country to find what you're looking for. Only on machinerypete.com.
Your call is very important to us. Please hold.
Well, the Trump administration taking an even tougher tariff stance this week, and John had a nice breakdown of what the steel industry has seen just last week. But it's a broader discussion on trade on tap for customer support. Here's John.
Jay Fritz echoes a comment I have heard occasionally during this debate over trade agreements and tariffs. You highlighted Ben Sass's commentary on the NAFTA talks. Noting that you sided with Senator Sass, I would remind you that very few agreements, even those between landlords and renters, are not renegotiated periodically, if not annually. As this agreement was ratified in 1994, I think it's prudent to look at changing some provisions in the agreement as things do change over time, and you are assuming that the original agreement was the perfect solution to the issues seen between the trading partners. Not saying that anything will or should be changed, but I see no problem with at least talking about it. I am assuming the current method of bringing the players to the table will be effective in starting the talks. Thank you for writing. There are several problems, I think, with this approach, as businesses who trade internationally will point out. The first is nations are not people. Comparing a rental agreement with NAFTA is a particularly inapt analogy. Trade agreements must deal in thousands of topics in precise details. They must balance the interests of thousands of businesses. A rental agreement is between two people about one thing. Anyone who has ever negotiated a merger between two churches or a consolidation between two schools can tell you how fast the complexity mounts up. And when you do strike a deal, it will be imperfect. But fulfilling the promise is imperative if you ever want to do another one. Second, people have millions of other trade partners, while for us there's only one EU or China for us to trade with. Scrapping one deal to look for another neighbor is not an option, unlike moving to another apartment. The biggest problem with agreement lifetimes or sunset clauses, however, is the uncertainty undermines customer confidence. Already, corn millers in Mexico have told U.S. farmers they are scrapping plans for new import facilities that would mean more U.S. corn exports, since investments that pay off over decades are too risky if they can't depend on NAFTA long term. In fact, that same long-term uncertainty is a major reason why farmers like me pay way too much for land. It's hard to grow an operation on year-to-year promises. Constantly threatening to end a trade agreement defines the U.S. as unreliable, and competitors like China are taking advantage of our fickle approach to keeping our word. They are building infrastructure that will last for decades for their trade partners. Who would you choose to deal with, given that choice? Trade is extremely hard to negotiate, and when an agreement is signed, it is imperative for countries to stand by them. You can make new ones, but repeatedly intimidating trade partners with cancellation means losing trade partners, and I don't blame them.
Thanks, John. Send your questions and your comments to John at mailbag@usfarmreport.com. All right, up next, planters are starting to roll, and we have pictures as proof after the break. Welcome back. Well, some planting photos getting us in the spring spirit. Brandon said it was a good week to start planting corn in northeast Arkansas. Spring brings out optimism in some, Mike.
Where it's warmed up.
And he said he's just thankful for the opportunity to start another year. I like his mentality.
That's right. They're also starting to roll in Oklahoma. Zach says planting is underway for this year, and he couldn't ask for better conditions.
And Trevor Smith says the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and today they started walking. Now, this is how they plant the 400,000 watermelon transplants on their farm, one plant at a time, all by hand. I have a whole new appreciation for eating watermelon this summer.
Yeah, sounds like my home, only 1,000 times bigger. And from all of us at U.S. Farm Report, I'm Mike Hoffman.
And I'm Tyne Morgan. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again right here next week as we work to build on our tradition. Have a great weekend, everyone.
U.S. Farm Report has been brought to you by Ram Commercial, America's longest-lasting heavy-duty pickups. U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast.